Hello everybody, it's Steve Bates of the BIA, welcoming you to the ABPI BIA Brexit Lead Network webinar of the 17th of December 2019. Normally we meet in person, but today it's a webinar as we agreed at our last meeting. And you're going to be a bit BIA heavy today, I'm afraid, and that's in part because Mike Thompson, as you know, the Chief Executive of the ABPI, is in his last week and unfortunately he's unwell, so we're not able to send him off with our best wishes before Christmas on this occasion, which is a bit sad. Elliot Dunster from the ABPI is in the process of getting married, so he's off with another celebration. And Richard Talbot, I know, wanted to be with us, but has been unable to make it on this occasion. But I know he's getting up to speed, and in fact, I've had a long conversation with him about the importance of this group in the last couple of days. So I'm delighted that Rick Greville is able to join us, and many of you will know Rick from all the work we've done on medicine supply.
And it's very rare for me to be called a lightweight in this situation. So I'll take this as very much of a positive on a Friday morning. So thanks for that.
Well, you've got to Friday. I only make it Tuesday.
Tuesday. Tuesday it is then.
Okay, and I may get Michael Warren, who's done a lot of the hard work as from the BIA perspective, to chip in. So, Michael, why don't you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. Great to be here.
So, really, the purpose of this is to give you a sort of update as to where we're at, and I'm keen to get feedback, and I think we can get feedback in the normal way via the chat on the WebEx system, on the GoToWebinar system. So, if you've got any comments, we'll come to those as we get to the end. So, I'm going to have a quick canter through where we're at, and let's get going. So, next slide. So, you're going to get go through where we've got to post the election, what we need to think about ahead of the transition period, which is now looks set to be from February. A couple of thoughts on the new context of Northern Ireland. Some thoughts as to how we need to think about this in the context of a global thinking in 2020, and we'll touch on what the shape of future negotiations may be. And then we're keen to make sure that we've updated again on supply, and I'll hand over to Rick for leading on that. So, keeping going, post-election. So, in case you've been asleep or not in the UK for the last week, there's been a general election, and it's resulted in a comfortable Conservative parliamentary majority. The new MPs are being sworn in as we speak, and they plan to get going fairly quickly with the new withdrawal bill in Parliament on Friday, receiving its first reading. And interestingly, as we'll touch on later, they're going to endeavour to tie their hands by saying that there's a legal provision that they won't be able to extend that period going forward. If you've not followed the campaign, I think that there's some interesting bits from the new government in terms of the pledges that they've made, particularly around the Innovative Medicine Fund. Some different talk really about how the economy may be run, particularly if you think about the importance now of northern working class voters to the support of this government, potentially some more interventionist state approaches, looking at things like state procurement and control of fishing waters. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I think we can see that this is unlikely to be a government, at least in intent at its early days, to be in the Thatcherite model when it comes to economic thinking. So we should watch out for that. A couple of thoughts really on a broader context emerging from the election campaign. It was in a sense quite an election campaign where green issues were fairly prominent, and the NHS and the nature of any deal with the US trade were particularly prominent, and we saw that in the leaking of the minutes around trade negotiations, the focus on the pharmaceutical industry, and I think that these are things that we need to think about in the new context for our industry as we go into 2020. In part because if details of negotiations or discussions between industry and government come into the public domain and are then a matter of political discussion, however they arrive in the public domain, we need to be conscious that that is likely to be a new a new context. The Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, here on the right-hand side, was particularly strong in terms of his position as a response to some of the things that were put to him in the campaign. You can see here Tories would walk away if US insists on including NHS in a trade deal. So perhaps some of the space for a trade deal is already given parameters by the discussion that's happened during the campaign. And we did see specific drug access issues feature prominently during the campaign. You can see a picture here of Jeremy Corbyn talking to a cystic fibrosis patient. And if you read The Sun the day before polling, you'll have seen the Prime Minister Boris Johnson meeting someone with PKU and promising access to the drug as part of his interview with Sun. So I think that there's some interesting things here that provide context as we go into this, and whether this changes things forever or provides a new context, I don't know, but I think it's how I'm thinking about framing my thinking going forward. Michael, Rick, any thoughts on this from your perspective?
It's been a fascinating campaign. I mean, health and the NHS is always really ever present in all election campaigns. But I mean, I think specifically the issue that came up around, the way that in a way the Labour Party really picked up on the issue of access to drugs really brought our industry front and centre in a way that was quite unique in many ways. Also the fact that there was kind of this tussle between Labour and the Tories over really who was going to get the credit or can be. And of course the Labour Party really kind of worked very well to take some of the credit for that. Corbyn, you'll see that's a picture of him with the kid, which he put on the front of the kid's drawing. He put on the front of his Christmas card. I mean, it doesn't get much more politically astute than that. So they really went in heavy on this. And as you say, Steve, the result is that a lot of the space has been narrowed, and that Boris Johnson pledge on the final day really could have a big impact on the direction of travel in terms of policy, but we'll have to see how it pans out.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose my only other reflection for many of you who work in global companies, perhaps some of the learnings of the UK election may shadow some of the discussion that we see in the States. I think there is close working between the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren thinking on the Democratic side of the House, and some of the groups that have been close to Jeremy Corbyn in Labour. So it'll be interesting to see whether you can see the UK election discussion as something that may be picked up in the US presidential debate or in the congressional debates going forward. Anyhow, preparing for transition. The outcome of the election was a clear Conservative victory. This means that we are now set to enter a transition period going forward. And I think I was interested to see that the views of our sector, which was a survey done by Jefferies and FTI Consulting mid-October into November on Brexit, haven't really changed over many years. Most people are still slightly or very negative about it, at best neutral, very few are positive, and despite the country being voting very, very consciously to get Brexit done, I don't think this is something that we see our sector having changed its view on, and risk remains constant. Just a reminder of what does transition mean for our sector. I mean, broadly, most stuff stays the same. Medicines and device regulation stays aligned with the EU. But the MHRA stepped down and come out of the European Regulatory Network. They continue to access databases, but can only attend committee meetings by EU invitation only. And in a sense, this is a formalisation of the de facto position, which I think has been established in the last few weeks and months. So, in a sense, for most of our businesses, pretty much steady state until the end of next year. But there does, of course, remain the risk of no deal at the end of 2020. There isn't a deal completed, so we can't say no deal. And there can be a decision by the Joint Committee to extend 1 or 2 years, but that has to be taken by the middle of the year. And the news this morning is that the Johnson government are keen to sort of rule that out as a political possibility by adding it to the withdrawal filter. So they want to get it done in a year. I think for some people, we've seen, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, that people have sort of left some of the stuff they haven't had to do on the shelf and waited to see what's happening. So if you're thinking now, well, actually there is clarity, we think that things may go forward at pace, and that's probably a reasonable assumption. What does this mean for people who work for me or I'm thinking of hiring? Free movement continues until the end of next year. EU nationals and families have to apply for new settlement scheme. The deadline for that application is still some way off, June 2021. And we don't know what will happen to a new immigration system yet. There will be a discussion about this, but it's unlikely to be in place extremely rapidly. But I think what it means is there's much of that information on our portal, and I believe it's also on ABPI information as well. It may be worth, if you've not had a look at this, reviewing and working out where you are on this, because people may be asking, and perhaps beginning in the new year will be the point at which people will come back and ask. And there's also a historic webinar with KPMG that we did back end of last year, which covers people in employment issues, if you want to dive into this one in detail. Now, no deal is technically still a possibility at the end of January if the withdrawal bill doesn't go through the UK Parliament and isn't ratified by the European Parliament. But I mean, I think my sense is that these are all the steps that have got to be gone through. Michael, do you want to give us just take us through what they are, and then we can have an assessment, Rick, as to whether we think this is highly likely, probable, not very likely, very unlikely, or impossible?
Yeah, so you said earlier, Steve, that the bill's likely to be reintroduced on Friday. There's some debate about whether it will have been changed from the previous version. Some people questioning whether those previous provisions, which kind of gave the House of Commons a sort of a role in shaping any future deal. So you remember there were provisions that were added in to placate the Commons before the election, giving them the opportunity to ratify or to vote on the final terms of any deal that the Prime Minister does with the EU during transition. That may come out. We'll have to see, although frankly with a stonking majority in the House of Commons, any vote such as that wouldn't be likely to cause them any problems anyway. So, you know, it may just be an academic point. Yeah, House of Lords obviously will scrutinise this as well, but it's inconceivable that the Lords would cause any major problem, given that there was a full commitment to this within the Conservative manifesto, and convention has it that the House of Lords never overturns something that has been part of a manifesto. So it seems extremely likely, almost dead certain, that we'll get royal assent for this at some time by early mid-January. It then goes to the European Parliament, where the chair of the Brexit steering group within the European Parliament will consider it, make a recommendation with that working group to the EU Parliament, and they will vote by simple majority. And if that goes through, which seems highly likely as well, the EU Council will ratify the treaty under recommendation from the Parliament. I mean, I think it was pointed out by Christiane and our team yesterday that the EU have already translated the withdrawal agreement into all languages of the European Union, and those are up and live on the website. So they seem pretty committed to this already. Yeah, well, I'll leave it to you to make the final call on the risk, but there's how the process runs.
Rick, you can see the 6-stage process here. What do you reckon? Is it going to happen?
I think it's going to happen, and it seems very reasonable from Michael's descriptor of the steps and processes involved. I can't see it failing in any one of these steps, really.
Our planning assumption, and often we've gone through these in the past and said, well, these are significant hurdles, you need to watch every single one, they're knife edge votes, all the rest of it. That no longer pertains. We lay out the steps for you here so you can see there are still a number of hoops to be jumped through, but we don't see these as major blockers. And I think you can see that the government remain technically ready for a no deal on the end of January, and they will continue to ask us to be so. But I think some of the focus and heat that was in this in the run-up to the previous deadlines isn't there. And Rick, do you want to comment on any of these things here about freight and express services or the supply disruption?
Not really, you know, not over and above the letter that Steve Oldfield issued in November. That seemed to capture the expectation and ask of industry quite well. and again summarised in the slide, so nothing over and above that. I suppose the question arises now from this morning's announcement as to the length of the transition period, and again, you've touched on that already, Steve, and perhaps you'll come back to it in a bit.
Yep, we'll talk about that in the negotiation phase in a couple of slides' time. So, Northern Ireland, obviously, cast your mind back to remember that the backstop in Northern Ireland was one of the big contentious political pieces between Theresa May, the previous Prime Minister, and Boris Johnson. And part of the change that Boris Johnson's withdrawal bill has in it is different to Theresa May's one. And I think it's just worth having a look at what that means. So there is a new Northern Ireland protocol, and it's integral to Boris's withdrawal agreement. And it basically puts a regulatory border east-west between the island of Ireland and the rest of the UK, and as risk-based checks on goods entering Northern Ireland, the potential for them to move into the Republic of Ireland, establishes a specialised committee to resolve operational decisions, and comes into effect in January 2021 if no deal is done next year. So this is, in a sense, it's an agreement in the withdrawal agreement for what we will do with regard to Ireland if a deal isn't done during next year. So it could happen as soon as January 2021 and will be the default position, but there will be a negotiation between now and then. And I think my main question here is, as we sit here in December 2019, January 2021 for a fully operational new system is not very far away. It gives us very little time to turn what is quite a sketchy agreement into a practical process for enabling licensed product to be served to patients. And not much of this has been really thought through in immense detail. So how's Falsified Medicines Directive going to work? If the UK regulator are the people who regulate in Northern Ireland, but they regulate to European rules, it's like having a football referee refereeing a rugby match. Are they able to do they access the video referee like you do in rugby? I.e., do they get access to the databases, or do they have to keep it under? And then how do you maintain that? And I think there's not been that much detailed analysis on this. I think the fact that you're going to have the MHRA regulating in a European context is the big thing that we need resolved. And also, what is the ask of industry? What is it practically we are being asked to do? And now I think this is an immediate question for us, and I think this is an immediate question to the EU. And now that the Commission are happy that there's going to be a specialist committee to look at the operational details, we are going to take, and I talked to Mike about this, our questions on this to this committee and say we need to be first in the queue for having an understanding as to how this can be operationalised, and we need to know. If you think about it, we were given far more lead time with regard to no deal planning. Really, the EMA had guidance out significantly in advance. In order for good operation, we need a guidance as soon as on this, and we don't have any. Obviously, what would be much simpler would be if the MHRA remains at the table, is a full member of the EMA. Continued close alignment would make things simpler for everybody who has access to databases. That would make it operationally easy and maybe politically difficult, but I think that would be our start of the 10. Rick, do you want to comment on this?
I just agree with you, Steve. We need clarity, and we need clarity urgently. There is complexity involved here, and alignment of regulation with Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Ireland, poses problems and challenges, certainly for medicines that are supplied to Northern Ireland from the mainland. And we have to remember that some wholesalers who supply pharmacies in Northern Ireland actually operate from the mainland. So we do know that the scenario of goods being transported, medicines being transported from the mainland to Northern Ireland is the reality of the situation today. Whether that will be allowed to be the scenario into the future, time will have to tell. So just to reiterate the urgency of getting to the bottom of this and getting further clarity.
So that's what we'll do. And Michael, you were kind enough to have a look through this. What I think was really interesting, leaked Treasury material that came out during the election campaign, but it gave some insight into Treasury, we believe, relatively recent Treasury, HM Treasury thinking about this. Maybe talk a little about the Treasury paper here.
Okay, well, there's two main points I'll make on this. One is that the overriding sense you get from this leaked paper is that the Treasury themselves and the government as a whole at the official level are not clear themselves about how this is going to work. This PowerPoint is really all about questions. And, you know, people who've had a skim through it, they'll recognize the little extract grid on the bottom right there, where there's a lot of question marks for both goods traveling east to west and west to east, where those questions just haven't been resolved, and they need to be urgently. And it's not just our industry that are pushing for it. Of course, it's any industry that's moving goods over to Northern Ireland and back again. Retail, food, manufacturers across the economy. So that's the first point. There is uncertainty at the heart of government on this. The second thing, which was really interesting, was that it revealed the concerns within the Treasury about this idea that there will be no checks about goods moving out of the single market into the UK. So this idea that we're not going to impose any regulatory checks or customs checks on goods moving from Northern Ireland back over to the mainland. So that basically kind of gives us no ability, if that is the case, and which of course that's what the Prime Minister promised during the campaign, gives Customs and Excise ultimately no ability to check on what goods are coming into the UK, into our customs zone. And that actually could be a breach of our obligations under WTO rules, where we might have to assure ourselves under WTO rules that we know what's coming into our economy. So two big questions really emerging from this, which need to be tackled urgently. I mean, so, and then I suppose the final point I make on this is that, you know, as you said earlier, Steve, there's a specialised committee being set up to look at this, which will be under the joint committee that's established by the withdrawal agreement. That committee itself cannot be stood up until the withdrawal agreement is ratified. So it can't even start work until the 1st of February. So the timelines on this are pretty critical, as you said.
So yeah, so I think this is my biggest worry at the moment. A couple of slides on the international context. So if you think about the WTO, UK trading under WTO rules, WTO itself has changed a little since we last got together. The appellate body, which provides essentially the court in the WTO, has fallen into unable to function mode because of the lack of nomination of new judges. And if you follow the discussion in the US, Canada, and Mexico about the new trade agreement there that replaces the what's it called, NAFTA. There was a change, last-minute change around pharmaceutical patents in order to get that through Congress. Remember, in the US, to do a trade deal in the US, it's not the president who does it; it's Congress who does it. And we've seen changes to that deal, which I think will set the precedent for how the shape of what US trade deals may look like. So potentially that, although it's been not welcomed by industry in the US, may make actually a trade deal in the UK with the US easier because potentially that difficulty has been removed because of Congress. And the final thing is medicine shortages. As an issue seems to be rising in prominence, and we are seeing a significant number of other states looking at either protocols for shortage and supply, and the European ministers getting together to think about whether this needs to be part of the agenda for 2020. So again, if you like, the WTO has changed, the trade deals scenario has changed, and the supply situation globally has changed. And as we go into next year, as we think about this, I think those are contexts which are all important for us as we get into negotiation. If the Americans won't agree to buy you, we'll have to break you up in parts, the doctor holding a trade talk sign says to the patient in this one. How are negotiations going to happen? And I think this is probably the key one in terms of timeline. Michael, you put this together. Why don't you take us through it sort of month by month?
Okay, good. So working from the top left. So at the weekend on Sky, Michael Gove reiterated the government's commitment that the transition period will not be extended. As you've heard over the last 24 hours, that's likely to be written into the withdrawal agreement bill. So the government are committed to this timeline. I actually put it together before the election, but it turns out that it's still valid now, more so perhaps. So those are the steps we've already been through on the left there. So Queen's speech, MPs vote on the withdrawal agreement bill, MEPs vote on the withdrawal agreement, and Brexit is almost certain to happen by the 31st of January. At that point, the transition period begins. It's scheduled to the end of 31st of December next year. So let's skip up from Brexit. So what happens after the 31st of January? Well, there's an almighty rush to get the negotiating mandates and dossiers prepared for both sides to take into the negotiation phase for the future relationship. Remember, the future relationship is not just a trade deal, it's not just a free trade agreement, it's also future relationships on things like security as well. There's a broader set of considerations for how the UK and the EU will relate to each other in future. But on each side, the dossiers will be prepared. The EU, in terms of the briefings and comments that have come out of the significant players there, like Barnier, who's going to head the EU negotiation team, are that they're pretty ready to go. They've already got a draft mandate prepared. They haven't released it yet to the EU Council, but apparently it's pretty much there. So they're quite well prepared. The UK government, well, we know it's happening behind the scenes, but of course, in a way, nothing substantive could happen on that until the general election. So we're behind, and there'll be a big rush to get that done over the course of January. And it is our expectation that there will be some discussion with industry during that period. And there's also a debate about exactly when the talks are going to start. But Phil Hogan, the EU Trade Commissioner, said that it'd probably be by St. Patrick's Day, so sometime around Easter. So I got it in there for March. Those talks will go on with some reference back to member states on the EU side as they go on, and probably back to industry on the UK side. There's the waypoint on the 1st of July where there's the decision written to the withdrawal agreement about whether we're going to extend past the end of the year. Further negotiations beyond that. If there's a FTA outline draft ready to roll, that will go to the European Council and the European Parliament and potentially member states to ratify through quite a complex procedure. There's a 33-page document that the EU has tabled and is in the public domain for the process of ratification of trade deals, which sets out the steps point by point, which I can share with people, or you can Google it.
Rick, I know that's on your Christmas list.
But suffice to say that the process of ratification of these trade deals is incredibly complex, and that's what sits behind a lot of the comments that you've heard in the public domain about how difficult it will be to get any kind of deal done by the end of next year, whether light touch or otherwise. So big debates within that process about whether we're going to stick with just issues that are subject to EU Commission competence, so that's the things within the remit of the Commission, or whether it'll broaden out to issues like, for instance, recognition of professional qualifications, which is a member state competence. So in a sense, the broader the deal, the more complex the process of ratification. I'm sure you've heard many people say that before. And there we go. Who knows what will happen by the end of next year?
No, thank you. I mean, I think this is the bare bones of how we see next year and the next phase going. And I think the key point here is there needs to be a decision before July as to whether there's an extension or not. So we need to know really Easter to summer as to whether it's on track or off track. And although the UK government do want to put things in the withdrawal bill this week, I remember the Prime Minister saying that he would die in a ditch to get the UK out of the EU. So we've heard some promises before which have not delivered on timelines. But I think we can see that there is a chance of we're going to need expert input from you to make sure that our industry position is well informed as this dynamically moves through the first half of the year. And then there's a significant chance of ratification challenge, even if a deal is done. Not this time necessarily with the UK Parliament, but actually with the member state parliaments and actually some of the other places. So ratification issues, if you like, switch from being on the UK side to being within the EU side. And that risk means there is still the chance that we get quite close to a deadline where there is a no deal outcome, or the Northern Ireland protocol kicks in and you have a no deal trading on WTA terms. So we'll be back in the same issues we've been in last year, I believe, at some point during next year. No deal hasn't gone away for us, and I don't think we should operate on that basis. Sorry, it took a long time on that one, but I think it's an important area. So can it be achieved by the end of the year? We've sort of talked about this. We can see, if you do something that's thin and easy, it might be more easier than if you do something that's more complex and more difficult. I think this is the key discussion for us as to whether there is, the trade-off is in the picture. The more access that you want to the single market, the harder it is, the more you diverge from EU rules and legal oversight. And I think that's probably the dynamic that we will see, and you can see how medicines regulation alignment fits into that discussion, which is core for our sector. But we won't be the only sector that's involved in this, so I think we probably need to be ready for it. Different member states will have different interests, and we'll have to see how it goes. And of course, we're not yet into this discussion, but the trade-off in the future trade relationship will be a broader one than our sector. Imports for consumers versus domestic production to support exporters, and then, how do different sectors fit within this discussion? Where are we compared to farming, financial services, automotive, and others? The government have been kind enough to provide a focus on life sciences and the importance of science and the innovation economy during the campaign period. We need to make sure that our issues remain front and centre, and I believe we're in a good place to do that. But equally, we should be conscious that share of voice will be fighting with many others, and for other sectors that will be immensely disrupted by the prospect of a no deal, farming and food being an absolutely key one. So a little rundown of the types of issues that those of us who've sat through this for a number of years look forward to engaging with: tariffs, rules of origin, state aid, how you roll over other deals, access to labour market, labour policy, fishing waters, less so for biotech or pharmaceuticals, but regulatory alignment, data flows, IP, free ports. All of this is what's coming at us next year. And Michael, I think you found a very interesting little nugget in a EU Commission report here that you've highlighted on the bottom right-hand corner.
Well, that's right, Steve. So, a lot of people talk about, the new kind of slogan from the EU is zero tariff, zero quota, zero dumping, isn't it? But I think it's important to note that even under a zero tariff arrangement, it's not necessarily plain sailing because of non-tariff barriers. So the reason that we put tariffs and rules of origin together is that the data shows that even with free trade agreements in place, the administrative burden on businesses to prove that they can complete the rules of origin checks means that a lot of them don't even bother applying to use the tariff-free scheme. So what we've seen here is that in terms of the CETA deal, the deal between the EU and Canada, only 37% of EU exports to Canada were done under that trade deal. So that means that 2/3 of businesses exporting to Canada decided they'd rather pay the tariffs than complete the paperwork on rules of origin.
And I think this goes to, the burdens and red tape of new types of doing business. And I think we are conscious and thinking this through. So if you've got thoughts or comments as to how your business approaches this, we know that all of pharmaceuticals are in the let's pay the tariffs because it's easier than rules of origin, or actually we're in the other position because regulatory position means we've got to know it anyway. It would be useful for us to know, and I'm sort of exploring this space as we go on. The good thing is that we go into this with the political declaration being the formal document in the middle here, where there is a commitment to explore the possibility of cooperation of the UK authorities with the European Union agencies such as the EMA in the political declaration. That remains the central focus for the discussion. But then we've had leading figures making expressions of direction of travel that are slightly different around the edges of that. And I've put two in here. You've got the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, at the Bioscience Forum, the BIA, talking about the importance of mutual recognition of products produced in the UK and the EU, and saying Plan A is Plan A, and that's what we want to go for. And then in other briefings, we've seen Boris Johnson hinting at major reforms to tax and industry post-Brexit, financial services and biotech among sectors. The PM wants to move away from EU standards. So I think we can see that this is a live and active debate, which we need to continue to remain very close to. The clear steer from BIA members to me at the BIA, and I believe for Mike and Richard at the ABPI, is continue to push for maximum alignment. It's been the consistent position for the last few years. We understand the importance of this for the sector, and our position remains the same as it has been really since the PwC work. We set it out again in our manifesto ahead of the election, and I know that there was a similar briefing from the ABPI, and actually in the ABPI statement post the election as well. So I think we are continually aligned, and this is what we're going to push for. So just make sure you're there. Rick, maybe you want to update quickly on the supply contingency before we go to comments and questions from people. Do please type in your comments.
Yeah, very happy to, Steve. And to be honest, the crystal ball for supply arrangements, contingency, as you will have heard, remains slightly foggy. It's slightly clearer than it was, but it still remains foggy in many parts. So let me take you back to look at history, because that is clear. And I referenced the Steve Oldfield letter of November earlier, outlining what the government's expectations on industry was until the 31st of January, bearing in mind the possibility of a no-deal Brexit at that time. Again, as you will have heard earlier, that the chance of a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of January has perhaps dissipated, but the chance of a future no-deal Brexit at some time certainly hasn't. So we need to remain vigilant in terms of this space. Again, looking back, you will have noted that as manufacturers, you will have had a light touch survey of your contingency preparedness in late November, early December, and I assume that gave assurance to the government that the industry remains as prepared as ever for the near future. But again, it would be remiss of us not to look slightly further ahead and into this transition period, which was flexible and may now be slightly less flexible. But nevertheless, it's a critical period. And in discussions between stakeholders within the supply chain and the government, we've arrived at bullet draft principles, which I think is useful to share with you at this point, because it tends to reinforce the collaborative nature of our work over the last 18 months and give some reassurance that the industry won't be locked off into a dark room and allowed to get on with whatever it wanted to in isolation. So in terms of the government, there's a recognition that it should communicate its future expectations of suppliers as early and with as much detail as possible. So again, that's a good basis. The guidance or the advice or the ask should allow suppliers and governments to take a flexible approach to ramping down if there's time, or maintaining their contingency planning whilst ensuring they can re-establish their multi-layered contingency arrangements whenever the end of transition happens. Again, earlier, Michael pointed out the useful waypoint of July for this first transition period, and certainly we'd be looking for government to issue significant guidance to the industry on or around July of this year as to what their expectations are for the 31st of December 2020. Whilst that work is progressing and whilst that guidance is being developed, we'd also look to government to clarify what its position was going to be for the end of transition period and what provisions it was going to be putting into place. For example, the government secured freight capacity is a critical one here, because in feedback that we received from our members, all manufacturers seem to be relying on the government secured freight capacity at least as a fallback option in any contingency planning. The guidance should set out milestones as to when future communications decisions will be made. I've touched on the waypoint of July 2020, but you can imagine if the transition period extends, you'd expect other waypoints to be introduced into this route map as well. And critical as well is not that we go into a further period up to July. Really important for the government to maintain its level of engagement that it's had with manufacturers over the last few months. And just as an example of that, you will already have received notification of a short webinar to be held by the Department of Health and Social Care at 9:30 tomorrow morning. So I'm sure a lot of you will phone in to that. That's me done, I think, Steve. Yeah?
I've got a scenario one here.
Ah, right, okay. Okay. So the two possible scenarios, again, it will be influenced by what's happened over the last couple of years, couple of days, I suppose. Yeah. So the government position now that it will have a trade deal done by December 2020 seems to be the front runner. But as I mentioned earlier, if this transition period extends, we will need an appropriate route map for that, whatever extension, with significant waypoints as well, similar to the July one that we've already outlined.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's great that we've got the update from the Department of Health available for people tomorrow. As you say, I think there is a slight, or at least a legal possibility of a no deal at the end of January, but we think that that's pretty low on our Richter scales. You know, Gillingham may win the FA Cup. They've not done it in 120 years. That doesn't mean to say that we don't go into our third round tie against West Ham with great confidence. But I think we have it as a low probability of Gillingham winning the Cup. And in the same way, I think we think no deal at the end of January is fairly unlikely. But we won't be able to put it entirely in the finished and done box because of the nature of negotiations, and certainly end of 2020 is one possibility, or possibly at some future point after that remains a possibility. So thank you for those of you who've put questions in on the system, on the GoToWebinar system. Just type away and on the chat, and we will endeavour to do them. So first question is: in the rush to get a trade deal done by 2020, December 2020, will that mean that UK will have to make concessions on regulatory alignment? Do you feel the rush is positive from this perspective? I don't really know how the negotiations are going to go, is the honest truth. I think that what we're trying to do is make sure that we're making a case based on what's best for patients both in the UK and the EU, and what's positive for the industry as a result of that. So, you know, building up information and data and sharing data, or whether that be around pharmacovigilance, whether that be about falsified medicines, is positive to patients, makes it straightforward for industry, enables you know, provision of various things, and in a sense, because much regulation remains national, but elements are at European level. Is there a way in which the UK can continue to participate? Is our core ask, because we think this will make it simpler, and we'll see where it goes. And we think that there is good headwind behind that from the positive noises we've got from the UK government. How that fares in the next phase, I think, you know, we're setting out on this course. We don't quite know what the weather will be like, and of course, the EU have played their cards fairly close to their chest, saying that it's all going to be straightforward. But then, at the last minute, we've seen some flexibility around things like Northern Ireland. So, this will be a negotiation, and I don't really know. Is a rush positive? Well, many members say uncertainty for an extended period of time is a thing that they don't want. The question is whether a bad outcome that gives you certainty forever is better than uncertainty for a period, and I think we're getting into that discussion, but in a new context. Will the ABPI and the BIA be lobbying for an extension to the transition period? I don't think we are at present. I think that will depend on what happens between January and April. If by Easter everyone's happy for the UK to continue in a close alignment on medicines regulation, and we've got straightforward things for our sector, then I don't think that we would see immense value. But if there are other questions or there's benefit to be got from that, I think we'd come back to members on that question. At the moment, we're not instantly doing it, but it's one that will come up for. Hi, Steve. Do you have any more clarity with regards to serialisation?
In terms of the Falsified Medicines Directive?
I take it that's what Sebastian's asking.
Yeah. So in terms of the Falsified Medicines Directive, if you take a no-deal Brexit off the table for the next year, at least, that means that the Falsified Medicines Directive will remain on the legislative books in the UK alongside the rest of Europe. And certainly the intention of SecureMed, the medicines verification organisation, is to maintain the system and engage and ensure that all stakeholders are able to satisfy their regulatory obligations for as long as those regulatory obligations remain.
So that's our understanding as to how it will operate as we go into the new year. I'm anticipating the next question for Sebastian, which is obviously serialisation is a process that has an early step in the manufacturing process, and therefore there is a lead time, because in a sense you need to know now what you're producing for your products and packets that will be on the market in 2021, 2022, and those lead times I'm conscious of are at least a year in many cases, which is why clarity about this at least a year in advance is really what we need. Is why we got the provisions that they wouldn't diverge on without consultation on industry for a 2-year period in some of the other discussions with the UK government. But it's this complexity that we need to get the specificity on, and that is why we are pushing. At the moment, we're using the Northern Ireland push point as the reason to do it, and we'll do that immediately. But I think this is also the type of evidence that we'll need to come to you guys for rapidly as we get into the new year and negotiating mandates are asked for from industry, which is what I'd expect to see January into February, formally or informally. Sabine's asking, will we continue the ABPI BIA Brexit Lead Summit? My intention is yes, and I don't think we're in a position to schedule everything jointly yet, in part because of Richard taking over from Mike. In what we've scheduled from a BIA perspective at the moment is we're going to do a webinar at the end of January, at the very least on the 20th of January, because we think by then we'll be in a pretty clear period as to what's happening early in Feb. We may need, if things have gone disastrously wrong, to talk about no deal next week. I don't think so, but more likely clarity about what the government's doing, negotiating positions, what do we need help with. If you can give us a beat to think about this, because I think you can see that there's lots going on next year, but the nature of trade negotiations may be slightly different to it all being about Brexit and no deal. So I think we're thinking through how best to do this. I realise we've spent nearly an hour going across the waterfront here. It may be that it makes sense to think of this slightly differently. We're thinking about this as an evolutionary moment, but we think that there is member desire for us to continue to do this. I think the associations are committed to doing it, but we haven't quite worked it out. But I think if you want to use this as a waypoint, and if the ABPI want to join us at this point, we've sort of set it in the diary, so we've got something into the new year, and I'd like to, by this date, be able to give you some clarity going forward. And I think perhaps a meeting in the first quarter makes sense, but we haven't quite got it fixed yet. Those are all the questions that have come in. I'm conscious that there's Christmas shopping to be done, Yuletide festivities to be enjoyed, and what else do we have to do this week of Christmas? A pub quiz going to be had on the backgrounds of your new MP, which I know is what I shall be spending my next few hours doing. So with that, I'd like to thank Michael and Rick for their expertise, their insight, you for attending and engaging with us. I know that we'll wish Mike all the best in his happy retirement, and Elliot all the best in married life. So thank you once again. Look forward to seeing you in January, and thanks for your insight and input. Many thanks. Bye.